Hey everybody, how's it going? Welcome to another edition of At a Glance, where I give you an appetizer, sampler, glimpse into a particular faction in 40k. The idea is to help you decide if you want to potentially collect it for your first force or your 42nd force. You would, decide whether or not you want to look further into them and make that decision. So this is just an idea to help you out, as I've done in the past with other editions of At a Glance. And this one's going to be on Hive Fleet Behemoth, a Tyranid force. Now, the thing about Tyranids is they're a hive mind, right? It's a hive mind that controls all the Tyranids. And Tyranid creatures themselves are bestial, instinctual creatures. They're feral. They don't have a real consciousness of their own to do things, just what their natural instincts would be. But with the hive mind's presence, they're formed into a very cohesive fighting force that's cunning, adaptable, evolves, and becomes very dangerous. So that's for all Tyranids. And Tyranids come from beyond the galaxy, so they're truly a galactically invasive species, you could say. And that's pretty cool. So Hive Fleet Behemoth is really the Imperium's, because 40k is basically done on the setting of the Imperium for 99% of it, is really the Imperium's first case of fighting against Tyranids. Hive Fleet Behemoth is the Tyranid Hive Fleet fought in the first Tyrannic War. They're the Hive Fleet that gave the Tyranids their name Tyranids. The Tyranids got their name from the planet Tyran, so they were named Tyranids because of that situation. But with that, this was the first time the Imperium fought against Tyranids, the first time the Tyranids really fought against stuff in its galaxy in a really cohesive manner, and both sides learned a lot, because the hive mind can learn, which makes the Tyranids a dangerous foe. And the Imperium learned as well, and they took heavy casualties in the first Tyrannic War. So the sector of space that Hive Fleet Behemoth battered into was the sector of space that contained the Ultramarines' mini-empire. It wasn't just their stuff, it was also the stuff around them. But because of that, the entire Ultramarine chapter mobilized against Hive Fleet Behemoth. There were some White Scar elements that also fought against Hive Fleet Behemoth. You have inquisitorial, not inquisitional. You have inquisitorial elements there as well. You have Skitaria, Mechanicum, and Knight and Titan elements as well. Planetary Defense Forces and other Imperial Guard, the Imperial Navy, the Ultramarines fleet. A lot of stuff rallied against Hive Fleet Behemoth. In addition to that, Hive Fleet Behemoth also encountered an orc planet and consumed it after a bitter fight. And they also encountered a fortress world that was the hidden base of the Death Shadows Chaos Space Marine Renegade chapter, and consumed that world. And it's not known if the Death Shadows were consumed completely or if some of them got away or whatever it is. The fate of that Renegade chapter is unknown. But that's another force that did have contact with Hive Fleet Behemoth. So those are all the forces that really fought against Hive Fleet Behemoth. Now, Hive Fleet Behemoth is like other Hive Fleets. It's got the Tyranid organisms in there, and it's consuming worlds, because everything about Tyranids is organic. Their hive ships are living ships. Their army is nothing but living creatures. The weaponry that they utilize, particularly ranged weaponry, is a symbiotic creature attached to another creature. So everything is organic. And they need biomass to grow, to sustain, to replenish losses, and to just do the general upkeep as well as get bigger and evolve. So they consume worlds down to the bacterial level. Nothing's left on that lifeless husk of a world. Hive Fleet Behemoth is no exception. It does this. And in doing so, it obviously wreaks havoc across sectors of space, leaving behind dead worlds and all that. So Hive Fleet Behemoth is doing this, encounters this big blockade, essentially this big defensive force against them, and that big first Tyrannic War battle takes place. Ultimately, Hive Fleet Behemoth loses, but in doing so, even though it loses, the hive mind learns a lot, and as a consequence of that, every future engagement with Tyranids becomes a more dangerous and more deadly foe, because every time the hive mind learns, it applies that to other hive fleets. Also, Hive Fleet Behemoth was learning and adapting on the fly because of the hive mind. So it wasn't just a foe throwing itself en masse at the enemy. There was that, but there was also strategic objectives that they were doing, forces they were taking out, ways in which the Tyranid of Hive Fleet Behemoth moved and did things. We have an example of this when the hive mind ultimately determined the thing that we know as Marneus Calgar needs to be killed, and therefore spawned forth the Swarm Lord for Hive Fleet Behemoth. And the Swarm Lord didn't just fight, dangerously against the Imperium at large, but specifically led Tyranid swarms against Marneus Calgar, and using its own cunning and strategies as well as its own brute force, nearly kills Calgar. We see a case of adapted strategy and a semi-unique creature. And I say semi-unique because it's not like Marneus Calgar. He's wholly unique in the fluff. If he dies, a new Marneus Calgar does not just pop up later. He's dead. With the Swarm Lord, it's a organism of the Tyranids. It's a biomorph. It's something that they can spawn again and again, and in multiple different hive fleets. So you have Swarm Lord of Hive Fleet Behemoth, and other hive fleets like Kraken and Leviathan and stuff could have a Swarm Lord as well. So it's unique in case of it's one in Behemoth's fleet, but it's replaceable, and it's not wholly unique to Behemoth. Another kind of, I would say, in a sense, more unique creature that Hive Fleet Behemoth spawned forth was Old One Eye, as it became known. This is a Carnifex that has one eye. The other eye is just a skull. Its skull is showing where its other eye would be. And Old One Eye is a Carnifex that doesn't seem to really ever stay dead. It's been confirmed killed over a dozen times, but continues to regenerate, get up, and run amok again. So that's another thing from Hive Fleet Behemoth that you could put into your own collection to help further refine the feel of your Hive Fleet Behemoth force. So that is something else. Hive Fleet Behemoth takes a huge toll on the Imperium. Naval assets were really reduced. Inquisitorial forces took damage, and casualties. Mechanicum, Scutari stuff. Titan legions, or Legion took some casualties and lost some Titans. You have White Scar casualties as well as Ultramarine casualties in space and on the ground. Their entire first company also was lost for the Ultramarines. They eventually recovered from that, but it was a pretty big blow. And worlds were devastated. One primary Imperial world, meaning a world that's really important, was absolutely destroyed completely. And other minor planets were also taken out by the Tyranids. So it was a big blow to the Imperium, even though they eventually won. Now the thing is with Tyranids, if they don't consume, they starve. So if you deny them consumption of worlds, you are slowly starving Tyranids, hive fleets to death. On top of that, if you're able to dish out more damage than what they are absorbing, so if they absorb enough biomass to regenerate stuff at this, just completely arbitrary factor of 1, let's say, and you're dealing casualties at a factor of 2, you are going to, through attrition, wear them down that way as well. So ultimately, Hive Fleet Behemoth is considered destroyed. It is whittled down drastically, and eventually facing annihilation, as most Hive Fleets tend to do. They splinter apart. So Hive Fleet Behemoth splintered into dozens of smaller fleets comprising just a few hive ships, one hive ship, a dozen hive ships, doesn't matter. These smaller splinter fleets scatter in all directions. And yeah, you're going to track down some and kill a decent amount of them, but others are going to live. And this fluff-wise leads to Hive Fleet Behemoth splinter fleet becoming known as Hive Fleet Naga, and posing a big threat to some Eldar craft worlds, and ultimately leading to the creation of the Doom of Malantai, which is referring to the death of that craft world Malantai by a Zoanthrope. So you could kind of trace that all back to Hive Fleet Behemoth, because it was a splinter fleet of Hive Fleet Behemoth that became Naga, that spawned forth the Doom of Malantai. So that's an interesting thing of note there. As far as Hive Fleet Behemoth goes, its color scheme, if I didn't say this already, I don't think I did. is red fleshy bits, blue carapace bits, and then their weaponry is black. So red flesh, blue hard armor, which is carapace, and then black weaponry, be it talons or their symbiotic range weaponry. It's a striking look for the Tyranids. I like it. And going along with that, you're going to need, of course, the Tyranid Codex to collect them. Basically, anything in the Tyranid Codex and anything really from Forge World that you would want to pick up can work for Hive Fleet Behemoth. And that's the one thing about Tyranid Hive Fleets that for me is kind of a strike against them, is ultimately you can paint up a Hive Fleet however you want. And if I take a particular army list, paint it up as Hive Fleet Kraken, and have the same army list painted up as Hive Fleet Leviathan for somebody else, and have the same army list painted up in somebody's own personal Hive Fleet idea, the only difference really is the color scheme, right? The feel, you can say there's some fluff going to these different Hive Fleets, of course, but for me it's the most, I get the biggest feeling of just palette swapped units than I do in other forces. You can make a similar case for other stuff, but if you paint up a force with all generic units, Ultramarines, and then you paint up a force all of the same generic units of Salamanders, even though they're exactly the same, just palette swapped, there's a lot of character building and development of those two factions that you may inherently play them a bit differently. I'm not saying you're not going to do that for Tyranids either, it's just for me personally, and you may not feel this way, I feel the Tyranids have the biggest case of just being a palette swap type of army list build. No real super defining characteristics, which is part of the Tyranid's nature. It's a hive mind. It's just one singular mind with these organisms doing its bidding. So it also, in a way, kind of makes sense. But anyways, Hive Fleet Behemoth, typically you might see artwork of them on like Ashen Plains or deserty type stuff, as well as snow and ice, but they fought everywhere. They fought on moons, inside installations, so you could do a Zone Mortalis type of build and it would make sense. On jungle planets, desert planets, urban planets, snow and ice planets, death worlds, volcanic stuff, whatever, right? It all can be done however you want. And then you can further enhance your basing of your models to help tell a story a bit by putting the Detritus of War on there. If you have access to bits for the Imperium, you can make it feel like they're fighting against the Imperium forces, or you could have Hive Fleet Behemoth and represent it as when they were taking out the Orc freebooters and make it look like Orky bases, Orky themed bases, so they're trouncing through Orc territory. Or you could do a Chaos Thief for the Renegade chapter, Death Shadows. You can do stuff like that to help further tell a story with your force, just as an idea. Also, don't be afraid to use any extra bits you have from your Tyranid kits on your Tyranid bases. We're talking about the endless swarm, essentially. You know, one swarm's going to go in, get wiped out, the second swarm's going to be running over the dead bodies of the first swarm to get to the enemy. So you can represent that on your base as well. Just keep in mind, Hive Fleet Behemoth and all Tyranids are a adaptive, evolving foe. Very dangerous. Because of Hive Fleet Behemoth, future Tyranid Hive Fleets that are encountered are that much more dangerous right off the bat. And throughout the entire fight of Hive Fleet Behemoth, it was evolving, adapting, and learning, becoming a more dangerous foe. So it was learning and becoming a more dangerous, harder foe to destroy, even as the tables were turning against it, which made it a dangerous thing to fight to the bitter end, which is pretty cool. But anyways, that's it for Hive Fleet Behemoth, so thanks for sticking through it. Hopefully some of you might have found this useful and interesting. There's only so much I can say about particular Hive Fleets. We don't have interesting characters or interesting personality traits to go off of, because the hive mind, which is interesting in and of itself, remember, it's one overbearing presence that controls everything. There's no individuality, no personality clashing going on. That makes them such a dangerous force, because it's not just that, it's also that and being cunning, adaptable, and strategizing, which is pretty cool. So that's it. Thanks for sticking through it. Leave any questions or comments or requests in the comments section, and until the next one, take it easy.